All right, good evening, everyone. And thank you very, very much for those of you who are able to join us this afternoon, the Sunday evening. I know we have a lot of problems with load shedding. I know some people have already told us that they will struggle to join us because of load shedding. But this session is recorded, so we will have time and opportunity to share it with others to look into it. We've got some friends of us, hopefully, that they're watching, that they will be tweeting. As we begin this, I want to first quote a couple of quotes that seem to me quite interesting to develop some of the thoughts that will emerge here. The first one is, there can be no growth without economic inclusion and without a business sector that reflects the diversity of our people and our society. There can be no inclusive recovery and reconstruction unless broad-based Black economic empowerment is at the center of our efforts. These are the words of President Cyril Ramaphosa as recent as this year. And so it seems that the pursuit of inclusive growth has been a stated goal of the South African government since 1994. Well understood, inclusive growth is supposed to combine the increased participation of poor and marginalized people in the growing processes of the economy through employment. It is also supposed to increase sharing in the benefits of growth via incomes, as well as benefits from social expenditure, including human capacity building, that would be about skills. This is the work of Fori that was published in 2014. Now, I think many of you who are familiar with GEAR, or the Growth, Employment and Reconstruction Strategy, it also really, in its introduction, articulated a long-run vision, as I said, for employment, rising incomes, and opportunities for the poor. And it also spoke really, really closely around this idea of inclusion. But we know that while the economy has grown over time, unemployment and poverty have struggled to reduce. South Africa continues to have high unemployment. In June 2022, we had 14.9 million people who were employed. That is the same level of people as the people who were employed in 2008, prior to the global financial crisis. We also know that even though the economy has grown by 20% since 2008, some 16.3 million people are living in extreme poverty. And I don't have to repeat the statistics that speak to South Africa's inequality, as it is referred to as some of the highest, if not the highest, around the world. So this is the first webinar in a series in which we discuss money, finance, and the economy in a manner that actually people can access, but also that allows us to evaluate the decisions in finance, in the economy, in government spending, and in investment particularly, but also in decisions that ordinary people can make to see whether or not we are able to make the decisions ourselves that take us forward. In this first webinar, we will discuss the role of BEE, the Black economic empowerment deals that we've seen over the years, in terms of economic inclusion and wealth creation and distribution. Many of us will know that the first discussion around transformation and inclusion was thought to be brought about by BEE. And we've seen many transactions since then through the iterations of BEE. We know some large JSE listed companies have brought about these. Have they actually done the work? So we have three questions today. What has BEE and its later iteration BBBEE achieved in terms of inclusion and wealth distribution? What options are available to South Africans to achieve inclusion and wealth distribution? And how do different social actors and ordinary people play a role? Now with me is a really, really fantastic panel to lead this discussion. Busisiwe Radebe is a development economist, formerly a senior economist at Nedbank Group. Busi is currently a lecturer at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. I think I'm saying that right, Busi, you let me know. Where she is also pursuing her PhD. Her research has a particular focus on poverty and inequality. And actually, Busi connects with us today from Amsterdam. And then I've got Duma Gqubule, who is founding director of the Center for Economic Development and Transformation. Gqubule has spent 2 decades as a financial journalist, over 2 decades actually, analyst, researcher, and advisors on issues of economic development and transformation. He has done extensive work on Black economic empowerment. And Duma actually has written a paper on Black economic empowerment project run by the Wits University Center for Inequality Studies. And that paper is called Black Economic Empowerment Transactions in South Africa 1994 till recently, and I will refer to that paper quite extensively. And lastly, Khaya Sithole. Khaya, of course, is a well-known accountant, academic, activist, and the writer that he is. He's educated as far as Oxford, and he joins us today from Joburg. And I want to correct that he will be joining us today in his capacity as a leader in APSIP, the Association for Black Khaya will have to tell me that.
Securities and investment professionals.
Perfect, thank you. I've just
wow, Xhanti. Thank you, Duma.
Thank you very much again for joining us. So let me first take this discussion. I'm going to first speak to Busi. Busi, we wanted to start this very clearly, defining the problem. I think many of us start right at the end about the transactions, the deals, but really, what is the problem that we've been trying to solve? So if we take it back and we think about, when we think about economic inclusion, when we think about these BEE deals, when we think about wealth creation, wealth distribution, what is the context in which we are working in? What is really the problem if we were to define it in clear terms?
I mean, Xhanti, if I had to think about it, what we were trying to achieve in the beginning is to reduce poverty and inequality between Black and white South Africans, right? That was our big deal. So let's look on the poverty side of things. Now, I've brought a couple of papers that I'm going to sort of refer to, and people can go look at these papers. I found them very, very interesting. On the poverty side, the first paper that I want to refer everyone to is a paper by Finn, Leibrand, and Woolard called The Significant Decline in Poverty in Its Many Dimensions Since 1993. So what they did is they went to go look at something called multidimensional poverty. So this is non-money metric poverty. Since 1993 till about 2010. And they said, I'm going to look at poverty of health. I'm going to look at poverty of housing. I'm going to look at all that poverty in South Africa that is non-money metric. So I'm going to look at all of that, and I'm going to see if there's been an improvement between 1993 and 2010. So it seems as if we'd made some improvement between 1993 and 2010. We'd reduced all these non-money metric forms of poverty in South Africa. We were actually leading somewhere. But they say beautifully in the paper somewhere, they said, all these non-money metric ones, we've somehow made some headway there, but the one that we haven't made headway with was just money. Okay, so keep that in mind. So they said, we've made headway somewhere, we've reduced all these other types of poverty. The one we haven't reduced is the money poverty. And then the other thing we were trying to achieve was to decrease inequality between Black and white. So a measure that we can look at to see what inequality is doing is what we call the Gini coefficient, right? And what we've seen since then, since sort of 1993, is yes, we have this huge inequality between Black and white South Africans. But currently, as we sit now, the Gini coefficient, inequality between Black South Africans is the highest. So we've tried to do something with poverty on the one hand, we got somewhere and then we got stuck, but we never actually made any dent in money poverty. Then we looked at inequality, and we looked at inequality between Black and white. Inequality in South Africa between Black and white, income inequality is still very high, but the highest Gini coefficient, the highest level sort of inequality, the widest gap is among Black South Africans. So that paper there is a paper again by Leibrand, and it's called Describing and Decomposing Post-Apartheid Income, Wealth and Inequality in South Africa. So it's a good paper, it's in development South Africa, but it tells us currently that inequality among Black South Africans. So think, what was BEE trying to do and where are we sitting? Then a second thing we must ask ourselves is, how is inequality transmitted in South Africa? So I've written a nice working paper that speaks about this transmission mechanism. So we know the transmission mechanism is, South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. So we're talking income inequality. The reason it's the most unequal country in the world is because different people, Black and white, have different levels of wage income, right? So different levels of money, different levels of wage income. The reason why they have these different levels of wage income is because they have different access to the labor market. So there's something going on in the labor market. Some people have certain jobs, other people have other jobs, and they pay different things. And the reason why we have different access to the labor market is because we still different levels of education and different qualities of education. And that's why some people will get certain jobs that will pay them that kind of money. And the reason why we have these differing levels of education is because we have different levels of socioeconomic statuses from where we come from our homes. So if your parents are richer, you'll go to a better school that will get you a better job, that will get you higher income. So we know that that is the transmission mechanism between Black and white South Africans. It's also the transmission mechanism between actually Black South Africans. So we've got that one. And then the other thing, we have to look at those wages we spoke about. Who pays those wages to drive that inequality the way it's been driven that way? So the first thing we need to look at is we know that government is a big employer, right? So we know government is a big employer, but we do know when we look at a lovely paper that is by Burger and Jafta and von Wintel that tells us, look, we know that government is this big employer. They are paying South Africans money. But we know that when they looked at affirmative action, that if we have this affirmative action going on, a lot of it is actually happening at the public sector, really. And when we look at the private sector, so the legislation is helping us with the public sector, but when we look at the private sector, more needs to be done there. If there is this difference in money between Black and white South Africans, if we've actually managed to try to close that gap somehow, it is not because of affirmative action policies or anything like that. It's because of that education thing, right? It's the education thing. But when we look at it, when we look at inequality, we see that when we come to the public sector, that's not a big deal. But when we get to the private sector, we start seeing something going on with those salaries and what is driving that at all. So, I mean, that is sort of the basis that we're sitting on. We're trying to get rid of poverty. We're trying to close this inequality gap. We know what is driving everything, and it comes down to wage income. It comes down to your salary that is driving this thing. So people will say that the thing that we need is jobs. And the reason why people don't have jobs is because they've got a bad education. And I absolutely loathe that. I think the education thing is correct. It is correct. Yes, we need to improve what's going on with education. But I do think a lot of the time it is the private sector sort of throwing this at government and saying, you need to do something about education before we hire those people so that they can get that money. And they're actually not doing anything. They're waiting and they're saying, look here, we can come off as very, very innocent and go, we're not going to, the top one is unequal wage income. We're going to do nothing about that because we're going to blame it on the other hand and go, listen, you need to do something about education. And we know that that is going to take a very long time. So that transmission mechanism we looked at, and we can look at each bit of it, is we need to find a place to stop it at each point. So what are we going to do? Well, it's the differing socioeconomic statuses that we need to take care of. And that comes from just that money that you're going to get from salaries, both from the public sector and from the private sector. And the private sector can do a lot more, yeah, but they're absolutely saying we're blaming government all this time. So that's the problem we're dealing with at the moment.
Thanks very much, Lisa. That actually is quite crisp and quite clear. And I think it will allow us to bring in Duma quite nicely. But before I do that, I want to tell everybody who is on the platform that it is, we will be taking questions later. So you can put some on the Q&A. So that is open for you. I see some people are trying to raise some hands. So in the chat function, you will be able to also give us some questions so that we can actually take your questions later on once the panelists have given us some first inputs, and then we will definitely be giving you an opportunity to engage with some of the thoughts that have emerged. Duma, I think your part actually slots in quite nicely here. Because Busi takes us to in the first part about the incomes of people, but we remember there was that big wealth creation right at the beginning. I wanted to give us your first thoughts around some of the work that you have been doing, especially in terms of these BE deals that have come in to try and define where we are going with wealth.
Thanks, Khaya. I actually don't know where to start the story. It's such a long story. And one part of me wanted to start with what Busi has been talking about education. Then when you talked about the president, I wanted to start there. So I'll start with the president, then I'll come. So now the president, in a previous life, I was a researcher, at the Black Economic Empowerment Commission, and we came up with this Black Economic Empowerment Commission report. And, fast forward, he was our boss. I worked in his office at John Nick Chairman's office, and I don't know, we left with Andy, who I used to work with, in the middle of the night. I don't know why, but I was trying to talk to him, and I said, why did we leave? I said, I don't know. So, but anyway, so the point is, fast forward to he becomes president. He says nothing about Black economic empowerment for 4 years. And the first time he talks about it, when he's under pressure, at the South African Communist Party's conference. And the theme that's coming is about the concentration of the economy. We've got to deconcentrate the economy. And I don't know when he spoke, the one that you just quoted. And that is just one thing that I found very puzzling about, the president's stance since he became president 4.5 years ago. And then the second thing on education, I've done 3 papers recently that are coming out soon. One is on the basic income grant, the second is on unemployment, and the third one is for the South African Council of Churches. Now, on unemployment, I just want to quote from this one. On unemployment, yeah. Can you see me while I'm reading from this? I don't know if it works.
We can see you very well. Go ahead. Okay,
so I just want word for word. Unemployment is not due to low levels of education attainment or skills. South Africa created 3.1 million jobs between March 2003 and December 2008, despite having low levels of educational attainment. If unemployment was due to low levels of educational attainment or skills, there would be millions of unfilled vacancies. Instead, there's massive spare capacity in the economy, almost 25%. Therefore, it's insulting to say that people are unemployable because they do not have educational skills. The East Asian developmental states started with very low levels of educational attainment. For example, in 1960, just before it embarked on its spectacular economic development phase, South Korea had 3.12 mean years of schooling per person. This was lower than South Africa's 4.17 years at the time. Industrial policies in South Korea and East Asian developmental states created employment for people with the levels of educational attainment that they had, not the ones they wish they had. They moved people from agriculture to labor-intensive industries such as clothing and textiles that did not require high levels of educational attainment. South Korea is now the most educated country in the world. The tertiary enrollment rate, people 18 to 24 in universities is about 98%. For Africans in South Africa, it's about 20%. And 70% of people between the ages of 25 to 34 have got a tertiary qualification. So as they provided mass access to education, industrial policies targeted more complex industries. So we've got 12.3 million unemployed people, Khaya. The unemployment rate is 72% for youth, 48% for Africans, 1% for African females, 51.8% in the Eastern Cape, and 44% for people of all races. So now, if there were 12.3 million vacancies and we couldn't fill them so we've got a problem of inadequate demand for the goods and services that companies are producing. And you see it in something called the manufacturing utilization, which is sitting at about 23% lately, and 77%. And the main reason for it, according to companies, is because of lack of demands for the goods and services we can produce. So what we need to be doing to solve this unemployment crisis, there is no way out of it except to increase aggregate demand. Now, in terms of the BEE deals, oh man, Khaya, I don't know if you know where to start on this one, but Oxalai, I just so angry some years ago that the private sector was strutting out all these fake statistics about how much Black people own. You might remember there's a study that came from the JSE that just made me livid. They said Black people own 23% of the JSE. And I said, South Africans, just think about it. The last time I looked, the JSE, where is it? The market cap of the JSE 2020, 17 trillion. Now, are you telling me that Black people own a quarter of the 17 trillion? It's impossible. So I went and did the numbers. It took me a long time over Christmas last year. 3 months sitting down, nothing else. you know, my children go to their mums during Christmas, so I just said so. I usually, yeah. So, but anyway, to cut a long story short, Black ownership on the JSE is 1.7%. That's the first thing. Nobody, I mean, I looked at the top 50 JSE companies, which account for 92% of the market capitalization. Now, the thing that shocked me, I always knew that most of the JSE refers to assets that are not in South Africa, but I discovered that 75%, an astonishing 75% of the JSE has got nothing to do with South Africa. We've got all these inward listings that distort the JSE. For example, Tencent, the Chinese company, and all these companies. So our JSE moves up and down because of stuff that's got nothing to do with the South African economy. So when China is putting restrictions on gaming, Tencent goes down and the whole market goes down, and Naspers and Prosus and all those things. So that's the second thing that I saw. But now, I don't know what to highlight there. So there was 245 billion rands of Black ownership. And then I'm almost there, Khaya, you can go next. And then the next thing is that most of the ownership was in mining and finance. About 70% was in mining and finance. And then the Black ownership was about 6.9% if you take out non-South African assets, because the BEE codes only apply to South African assets. So it was 1.7%, the whole JSE. And then I have to take out the 75%, the most difficult thing I've ever done in my whole life. You have to calculate the value of South African assets for every of the JSE companies. So, and then I came to some methodologies. So mining and finance accounted for 70% of the Black ownership. And we have these charters in the mining and finance sector that give companies a get out of jail card. So they don't have to do empowerment again because of this once empowerment, almost empowerment. I'm simplifying a very complex issue, and I'm sure Khaya will explain it in more detail. But the point that Oksalayo, they don't have to do BE deals. So now, if the mines and the banks don't have to do BE deals, why does everybody else have to do BE deals? So the government, to cut a long story short, they messed up their own policy. They completely messed it up. They ruined it. BE doesn't exist in South Africa anymore. Nobody takes it seriously. And I've stopped talking about it, Khaya, because I think it was at the mining Indaba. Gwede Mantashe invited me to speak at the mining Indaba just before he released Mining Charter 3. And I told everybody my story about mining transformation. Soon after that, the government went and does that Mining Charter 3, where all the mines get off scot-free. They don't have to do BE deals again. So there's once empowered, always empowered. So to cut a long story short, AngloGold sold the mines to Patrice in 1998, and AngloGold is still claiming Black ownership points how many years now? 24 years later, and it's allowed by this wonderful government of ours. And the last thing I want to say is that this thing became so complex. I remember once I was presenting, Bridget Radebe invited me to meet with decision makers in the mining industry at the Hilton. And there was this guy who was the head of the Parliamentary Committee on Mining. And he was listening to me and he didn't say anything. So during the lunch break, he comes to me on the side and then he says, "Hey, Comrade Duma, you know, I want to ask you," he didn't understand what I was saying, and he wanted me to explain to him in plain English, you know. So the head of the Parliamentary Committee in Mining had no understanding of the technicalities of empowerment in the mining industry, and that speaks to me on so many things. Thank you so much. Yeah. I'm done.
Okay. These are interesting points that you bring up, but I'm sure Khaya will be able to pick up on it. Khaya, you are very intimately involved. I mean, I guess being a leader of Black investment professionals, the kind of work that you are trying to do. What is the problem we are still trying to solve in terms of where you are standing? And of course, given some of the work that you've been doing, especially if you are reflecting also in what is being said here.
It's the unmute button, sorry. Good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for that. So the question is, what are we trying to solve? Well, the answer is quite simple, and That answer pisses off a lot of people. The very simple answer is that we do not know what it is that we're trying to solve. And the reason we are very unclear about what it is that we're trying to solve is that if you take your mind back to where we were 30 years ago, and we're talking about the idea of transitioning power from one illegitimate government to a democratic structure, there are parts of it that were very linear to explain. So of course, when it comes to the condition of universal participation in the ballot and opening up the democratic process, you can very clearly explain what that is. When it talks about opening up access to social services, you know exactly what that means. It means that everybody on their basis of being a citizen should be able to access a pension, things like that. The very difficult part of it related to the question of what the economic handover needed to look like. And the reason the economic handover question was so intractable is that there was a universal consensus at the point of doing the transition that you didn't want to have this gap, this missing decade, as it could be, where, for example, if you look at Idi Amin in Uganda many years ago, when he decides that he wants to exile people of a particular race, and it turns out that he's essentially closing down the nucleus of the business sector in the country. So South Africa had obviously learned from those, and there was a very clear understanding that you didn't want to have that gap where there was an economic gridlock overnight because it took many years. So in order to deal with the question of the transfer of economic power, the idea was that you needed to be as flexible and as nuanced as possible. And in that, unfortunately, far too many concessions and far too many compromises actually defined the essence of what we're trying to do. So the essence of what Black economic empowerment was really trying to achieve was to say, look, we understand the big dimension of trying to transfer economic power from a minority audience to the wider population out there. However, this is not the type of thing where you simply say, hey, in that farm, it used to be Vandemerwe, Xhanti will run it tomorrow, because we had very obvious and acute lessons of what the consequence of that might be. In the South African context in particular, you can imagine that even if I had been part of a generation of farmers from before 1913, the fact that we had been taken out of our land from 1913 up to 1994 simply means that we had had 8 decades of actually not being actively involved in farming operations. So even if it turned out that I could prove overnight that this farm used to belong to my family, if you put me back there with 8 years of absolutely no knowledge of how to do it, the risk was always that it was actually going to have adverse outcomes. So that's just one example of the difficulties and the trade-offs that we needed to be able to put together. And if you look at the example of Zimbabwe, for example, that is probably the one thing that they didn't get right in relation to the transition around the farms, because if you simply do not have the skills to run it, it simply means that at the end of the day, you have inherited nothing. So that's just one of the problems that we have. Now, obviously, in the South African context, what we then went for was a model that simply said, okay, let us create a model that says that there's going to be a gradual transfer of power, of economic power, and that gradual transfer of economic power worked on a lot of very elusive expectations. So the very first expectation was that, okay, all the business leaders that would have been part of that conversation bought into it. In other words, if we decided that 25% was the number, there wasn't going to be any form of resistance from the business elite, because everybody understood what the big picture was. So that is one thing that you probably did get right. What was also to be expected was that, well, at the end of the day, ownership, for example, is but just one element of what a business makeup is all about. So there had to be other elements that were going to be cultivated and harnessed over time in order to get us there. The problem, of course, is that the requisite investment in the skills and the infrastructure that would have enabled us to say, wait, hold on, 30 years down the line, if it turns out that in the basic education system, 90% or 95% even of the learners then are Black students, we need to see that linearity being maintained throughout the economic and social system. So if at the school level, 95% are Black, why is it that at university we don't see the same demographics? Why is it that in the workplace you don't see the same demographics? Why is it that when we look at JSE CEOs, you don't see the same demographics? So that for me is what we got spectacularly wrong. So by us getting that dimension spectacularly wrong, we ended up having a fixation on the one element, which was ownership in particular. That was always the most difficult one to solve. It is not difficult to sell to a company that it needs to have a workforce, because in order for it to deliver services, people need to be there. It is not difficult to explain to a company that it needs to invest in the community that it operates in, because there is a universal understanding that if that community buys into what you do, your prospects of success are much higher. It is a bit more difficult for you and I to have to go to an AGM where 1993, 1994, the entire shareholding is made up of 100% old white men, and to simply say to them that the only way we can facilitate the deal is for you to relinquish a part of your wealth. Because if somebody says, I've invested in this company for 20 or 30 years or for multiple generations, I'm now being told that 25% of it must go to someone else on the basis of what they look like. That was never going to be an easy conversation to solve. So the fact that we made it that far, even in the post-1994 dispensation, to even have numbers like 25%, for example, is a monumental achievement. The great tragedy, of course, is that there was then the question of, well, fine, you can convince them to relinquish a part of their equity and a part of their wealth, but it is a bit more difficult to then say they must then finance the loss of their own wealth, in the sense that if you say to them, give us 25%, but then you must pay for us to be able to do that, it was going to be tough. So what then ended up was a model that then said, okay, fine, we're going to have some loan structure where people in finance made a whole lot of money. We're going to have this loan financing model, which simply says that if you as Black shareholders want to get 25% of our business, fine, we will do that, but you must just pay for it, okay? So that dilution of wealth came with this model that says that you must be invested in this, so we're going to lock you in for a few. The problem with that is that I, as this Black investor, now suddenly I'm on a different pedestal compared to any other investor, because the economic windfall associated with record profits being declared in a year, for example, is not the same between I, as a Black investor, and you, as a traditional white investor, because you get the full amount as a dividend and you can do with it as you please. I, on the other hand, have been directed firstly to repaying whatever financing I used to get into the structure. And if there is something left, then I can get something. What that then creates, it then creates this incentive for all of these individuals to say, the moment I'm able to access the economic windfall associated with what I've been told is an ownership stake, I want to be able to do with it as I please. So what you then see is that at the end of all the lock-in periods, everybody says, well, actually, it's my money. So if I decide that I want to invest in company B and company C, I should be able to take that ownership stake, sell it on the open market, and then say, this is what I'm doing. That then creates a problem that Duma then has to deal with, because now suddenly, at the end of the lock-in period, it becomes remarkably difficult for any company to say whether the answer is 25% or not. Because in the secondary market, there is no obligation for me as a Black shareholder to tell the primary company that I've sold to Xhanti, or I've sold to Duma, or I've simply sold it to some other corporate structure. So the moment you lose that ability to track it, it becomes really a fugazi, as you can call it. Everybody just speculates their way through what the question of ownership on the JSE is. So I can say categorically, absolutely not a single person knows today what the Black ownership on the JSE is, and we probably may never know because of what the market dynamics are all about. So the question that I then believe we should have been raising is a very simple one, to say to all the guys that were sitting there in the financial sector transformation charter, for example, so what exactly was the big plan after all these lock-in periods expired? Because surely as people were putting these deals together, you should have acknowledged that when you say that the lock-in period is ended and you say to these investors that, look, this belongs to you, they are free to do with it as they please. Then the question then becomes, the day after the lock-in period expires and all these Black institutional and individual shareholders sell their shares, is the company now supposed to ink together a brand new BEE empowerment deal to replace that original 25% stake? And that is a conversation that we ran away from when we should have dealt with it. So what has then happened is that it's now happening on a sector-by-sector basis. The mining sector has had to deal with it in different ways, including litigation. The banking sector is trying to deal with it in different ways, and we're going to see that happening everywhere else. Just one last very critical point that I think Duma has raised. We also must acknowledge that when these conversations started, the structure and the architecture of the economy was fundamentally different from what it is today. With, of course, the irony that Anglo essentially owned everything and everyone else. What we now know is that the two commanding heights of the economy today are simply the financial services and, of course, part of the mining sector. So as Duma said, if those two sectors in particular do not get this right, it actually becomes irrelevant what everyone else does, because collectively we still won't have reached nirvana. So that for me is the great BE conundrum, in that firstly, even in the conceptual design, it seems that the most difficult conversations around what was the ultimate goal were never really tackled. So now what we're seeing is that many years later, we're now having to try and work our way and maneuver our way around questions that inevitably have changed in tone and substance, and given the fact that some people have done so remarkably well, like the president, these are conversations that have now become less linear, because everybody can say, wait, hold on, how can you say it didn't work if it took somebody from being a mining union boss to a multi-billionaire overnight? So surely it works. Just because it didn't work for Khaya doesn't mean the system doesn't work. Is that a legitimate question? Not no.
Khaya, can I just add up to what
Go ahead,
Khaya
go
was
ahead.
saying? Yeah, about Anglo. It's a very important one, because Anglo in 1993 owned 43% of the JSE, like across all sectors, you know, and then they had to unbundle and do sector focus and sell to black companies, and Jonic and all those, Amplats and all that. But when you look at the mining sector, I sent you a report I did on mining. They just consolidated in mining. And if you look at the value of South African assets, I think Anglo was owning half of South African mining assets. And when I did the study some years ago, they still owned, they controlled Kumba, Anglo Plat, biggest platinum producer, biggest thing producer, iron ore producer. And now, so they still controlled half of the mining industry. So what I was arguing at the time is that, you know, Anglo must come back to South Africa, and we must do a restructuring of this Anglo. I actually went to I had an interview with the MD of Anglo where I put this to him, and that, you know, we must split these companies, the foreign Anglo and the local Anglo, and let's do a proper empowerment in the domestic Anglo. But anyway, that's what I was saying. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So here are the things that seem to be emerging. So Busi says, we know that there has been some, alleviation of poverty, at least in terms of non-money poverty. So there's education, health care, access to housing, but not so much in the money. And then you speak about this issue of skills and the education system, and saying it's a cop-out to just actually say the whole issue is around education. I think Duma agrees with you. And that in many ways, if we are to create inclusion and actual wealth, rising incomes, people need to get the right kinds of skills and the right kinds of jobs. But those are actually about having some excess in terms of a pocket, so having a good job, and that really is. And then, are we discussing here with him, which might be related, I'm not so sure, to who gets the deals? We're discussing not just incomes, but also social capital.
We absolutely are. I mean, I want to go back to what Khaya said by saying, you know what, just because some people have benefited from it and Khaya has not benefited from it, that is sort of a problem that we're dealing with. But it was a handful of people. So my research looks at inequality among Black people, but I look at it in a very specific lens. I can bet you look at it in another lens again to see the difference between who got the deals. And you can look at it that way, right? That's the driver of this biggest Gini coefficient in the country that's among Black people. Some people did get the deals. It's a handful of them, and they're skewing the numbers ridiculously. Even whatever, like a Sithole deal or whatever deal that you could have gotten, it was people like me getting it. It wasn't the majority of South Africans.
Isn't there something to be said?
It was people like Khaya getting it. It was people like Duma getting it.
Isn't there something?
So we'll go back to the skills.
Yeah, but before you go there, isn't there something about seeding? Because from what Khaya, what everybody's saying, we're not going to be able to push everybody in at the same time. But one would have thought, I mean, Duma, you will know this because I'm sure in those days that was discussed, that thing about eating the intro from inside, I think it was, where you must go inside there and then eat it from inside. So basically you needed to be part of the system to change the system. So if there are some people who have been included in the system, they would be the ones who actually help. So those handful of Black people who have access. And I think you tried to refer to this also, Khaya, where you were talking about some of those directors that have been brought in. So you have these Black directors in bigger numbers than we have in the billionaires, or in the bigger numbers than we have in the shareholding, as Duma has said. So you have more directors representing these companies than owners of the business. So one then thinks, that seeding in the number of people who have been educated, in the number of people who have been who have their whole directorships in these big businesses, the number of people that have had some shares who therefore can educate and do all these other things. Why isn't that model working? Anybody can take this question, because it seems to me.
I mean, I'll tell you a story. I don't know it was how many years of BEE, and Andile Mazwai wrote, a bunch of people had to write a bunch of stories about BEE. And I will never forget Andile Mazwai's story. He said it is the way he was looking at BEE at the time was it was a bunch of people, black and white, so the black owners of whatever, the white owners of whatever, and the few people, the few black people that have been invited to the table. And all these people were sitting around the table, sort of the handful of black people and the rest, a lot of white people were sitting at the table. And they were just having a sumptuous meal and it was incredible. And just outside, it's sort of, and they were enclosed in a piece of glass, and just outside was another black person who desperately wanted to actually be at that table. And the black people at the table would do anything to actually keep their positions at the table, because every time they looked sideways, they'd see the other black person there that would do anything to actually just come get your seat at the table. So there weren't enough tables. They just literally were not enough tables, because the people there at the table just didn't want to lose it. The black people at the table didn't want to lose it, because they know just outside is someone who'll do 10 times whatever I was doing to actually get my at the table. So I think it wasn't enough. It was supposed to be a concurrent thing. That's why I think the skills thing is the cop-out. I think it is. It was, yes, we could get those handful of, it wasn't even a handful, it was supposed to be more than a handful of black South Africans who were going to do that. My old boss used to say, almost as also an example to the rest, that this is what we've done. It's a symbolic thing that we've done. So we have our president really being enriched by that. It's something symbolic that we're doing. But on the other hand, we were supposed to do the skills thing. We were supposed to do, it's not one or the other. It was supposed to be sort of both of them. We were supposed to look at multidimensional poverty the way we said, but somehow in 2010, we seem to have stopped on that. So it's just, we made progress with the multidimensional poverty stuff, where we try to fix the education stuff, try to fix the health stuff, access to water, the service delivery things. That was an arm. That was what we were supposed to achieve. So we did a bit of that. We were supposed to, so that was one hand. The education thing was one hand. The jobs thing, it was also doing the deals for the people who can, but to actually create more people who can be part of the deals. Because I can tell you now, there are 57 people on this call right now. And literally, we should not be giving them BEE deals. It's not for them. It's for the people in Alex. It's for the people in Khaya. It's literally not for the people on the score. So we need to, so that, do it in such a way so that the person in Alex can actually, the person, I mean, the Grayson Bridge is a brilliant example of this. It always killed me that I used to drive to go to the richest square mile in Africa. So I used to drive and I used to stop at that traffic light. And I used to see all this labor from Alex going over to Sandton constantly. But the richest of Sandton never went the other way to Alex. So we must do something to get more people from Alex who can actually then buy the deal. So we didn't empower them in that way so that they can do the deal. So it didn't work that way.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to take some of, I think there's Technopark, I wonder what his name is, and Thandi, who've been wanting to say something. Before I do that, Khaya, I want you to think about some of the work, I mean, the great work you've done in terms of bringing in young people very well to be skilled, to be CA is a key skill in financial services, a sector, of course, that we know has grown. I mean, the financial service sector is now what, 26% of a quarter of this economy in terms of what it contributes, and a lot of young people. And it is also part of where we are, that we're generating a lot of the revenue. So where is it not coming through in terms of then actually giving us a kind of transformation and inclusion that we need? I'm going to allow, okay, I think I've lost that person who had Techno, you can talk, I've allowed you to say something. If you unmute yourself, so there's somebody there called Techno Spark who's been wanting to say something. Okay, we'll come back to that if you don't want to say anything. And then there was somebody else who also had their hand up for quite a while, Xhanti. No? Okay. Again, everybody, if you want to comment, there's a Q&A section there. There's a comment section. So everything is available to you should you want to participate in the discussion. Khaya, look at the work. Okay, Ponso, I've allowed you to speak. So if you unmute yourself, you'll be able to say something. Ponso Samuel. Just unmute and then say something.
Thank you.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. I have a question for. It's the first time I joined this. It's the first time someone else invited me. So I have a question for Mrs. Radebe. When it says, because we don't have a job in South Africa because we have a bad education. So I just want to know, how can we done to get a better education in South Africa? I don't know my question is right or wrong, but I don't, yeah.
I'm not understanding. Try again. So how can people try again one more time? I didn't hear you very well.
Oh, you're catching. You're catching a lot. Okay, fine. I have a question for Mrs. Radebe.
Yes, go ahead.
Right?
Yes. Okay.
Okay, good. So, Mr. Radebe, what you're trying to say is the reason why we don't have a job is because we have a bad education.
Yes.
Right?
Okay.
So I just want Mr. Radebe to elaborate that. It's what I'm trying to. I'm confused there. Only the reason why we have a bad education. I just need to elaborate on that statement.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. Thanks very much. I think she's heard you very well. And then Lorato, yes, my friend, go ahead. Lorato, you are allowed to speak.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for hosting this, Xhanti, and to the inputs to your three panelists. I want to ask almost a question that is not necessarily directly to BEE, but more to Black ownership, right? So, and as Khaya has, pointed out how some of the dealings are done in terms of particularly how, there would be a loan scheme of some sort and the likes, which to a great extent that empowers the owners to be able to, or at least to have a lot more money to be able to purchase stakes, or at least, have the money to be able to do whatever they will with it. My question is, do we see Black ownership being realized in the way that we look at it? And I ask it with this context. I don't know if you know or if you have heard. I heard that it was reported that Toshia M, the Black-owned cosmetics company, was once at some point offered the owner was offered 60 million rands as a buyout from the business. And I look at such, if suppose it was a transaction, such things where you have emerging and growing black companies that create the capacity and the capability to not only just be traders, but to also be producers. They are almost wiped out of the market. And I guess precisely because the white people would always have access to cash and be able to continue in this ownership pattern. So my question is, how do we deal with this? Because even if it was not just looked at from a JSE point of view, the likelihood is that when Lorato, I own a PR company, as I grow bigger, I'm likely to be taken over by a bigger white-owned agency, and of course, for many reasons, I may consider that deal. And I'm just wondering how we deal with that conundrum. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I'm going to give you some time to clarify. I think that was an important question from Ponto, and then I'll leave the two other gentlemen to actually speak to the two other parts that I guess two questions that Lorato has brought on board. Thanks, Lorato, for that.
I mean, the Ponto thing, I don't even want Black South Africans to blame themselves on what I say by a bad education. So let's explain it this way. So when we speak about unemployment in South Africa, when we look at the unemployment numbers, we look at it, the number they talk about on television or whatever, they look at everyone that is unemployed. But if you go look at that same publication from Stats SA, they actually divided up into education levels and who is unemployed when we look at education. And that's important. When you are degreed in South Africa, your unemployment level is something like between 6 and 8%. That sounds almost European, almost sort of American. So there is something that is going on. And usually, I think it was Nick Spall who did a beautiful thing for the president where he showed why this is so. So he started off with saying, okay, when I look at that unemployment level, when you've got a degree, I've got a far better unemployment level, more people with a degree are employed. And if I look in Europe or anywhere in America, I can see, and I see there, not everyone with a degree actually gets employed. People can have a 2-year college certificate, they can do whatever, and they're employed. So there's something perverse, something strange happening in the South African system where I need to have a degree before I get employed. And that degree Nick Spall has shown us is actually a measure of quality for what is going on at high school level. So people still want to say, you know what, I so don't trust what is going on in South African high schools in terms of quality education, not that the children are stupid, not that whatever, nothing like that. I so don't trust it that actually I need someone to have a university degree for me to know their quality of education. So we know that Van der Berg from Stellenbosch has done a whole lot of research to check out what is wrong with this quality of education that we are seeing in South Africa. So when I was in school, in university, I was taught by Van der Berg, and I knew the stat that 1 in 10 white South Africans gets an A aggregate in matric, right? And 1 in 1,000, it's changed now, it's better now, Black South Africans gets an A aggregate in matric, and half of those went to sort of a white school or former Model C school. So there's something that is still happening at Black schools that is doing something. So we do know that one of the reasons, if you just go on a micro level, it is really we need teachers in class actually teaching. We need teachers who actually, I mean, that Nick Spall thing, maybe we can put it up later to show you that teachers were given, I've got it on my computer and we can put it up, teachers in those schools that we're talking about were given a test for grade 5 mathematics. And then we try to see who passes that. And you could see the teachers who didn't pass that actually were in the former whatever Black schools. So we know there's something with the quality of education happening there. So it's not the students, it is we need proper teachers and we need a principal who's going to keep our teachers accountable. So the thing is the principal, the leader of the school. So there've been there's partners of possibility that have done things in South African schools where we've had principals who've been successful adopting a principal in a school that is not that great to try to bring them up to standard. So that helps quite a lot. So it's not so much sort of the students that are the issue, right? So it's not the students, but it's also, I find it a cop-out again, right? I find it an absolute cop-out. So we've been telling, and we know when we look at those degrees, and I think one of the other panelists spoke about it, we know when we look at those degrees, when we look at things like that, we know that black and white salaries, so there is still something missing, only start equalizing when the black person has a master's degree. There's no difference when we get to a master's degree level. So there is still something that is strange that is happening there. There is still something, it must just be okay, because I can't have a white person with a sort of matric and then sort of the black person has a master's degree and then we start equalizing. So something strange is happening there. So we've been asking black people to fix themselves all the time. So we've been trying to fix this whole, this supply of labor. So fix yourself, as if we've got power to do that type of thing. We don't. We don't have power to fix schools. We don't have power to fix sort of, as an individual, obviously, we don't have power to fix the principle. We don't absolutely, that is, so there is a problem there and we need to sort it out and government needs to help us to sort it out there. That is one thing. But the other thing that where I say the cop-out comes is, the other thing is, listen, we also need to do something about the demand for labor. You cannot tell me just in South Africa, we've got something very, very special that you need to first be degreed before your labor would be demanded somewhere. So government can come in and tell the private sector and tell people, you need to hire, we're going to give you something and you need to hire this labor. So we've got the supply, we've tried to fix the supply, and we know that black people are just really, they want every degree, it's everything. It's like my ancestors' wildest dreams, I got my 50th degree. They really are trying to do that. So supply is help, it's individual supply is, but the demand needs to work. And that's not something we can do. Government needs to do it. They need to lay down the law and say, you need to hire these people, tell us what you need, is another thing, tell us what you need, and we'll train people for that, but you need to hire our people. And it's a cop-out, because in Europe, they do it, they hire the people. They're like, I'm just telling you to hire the people, and they hire the people.
Thanks for that. Khaya, I think you come in very nicely here, because we've done a lot of work in supporting people in education and making sure we are getting those people out there as part of the supply.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. And I think, I mean, the brief summary of how I started doing that work was that when I started doing my accounting articles, which back then was still quite something very difficult for a lot of black people to get into, I remember observing with a sense of horror that there were 12 of us that started this program. And of course, those are the 12 that first trend said, look, in the long run, this is the pipeline that we're grooming to be the leaders of this bank in the future. And of those 12, I was actually the only black South African. And I specifically went to the CEO of the bank at that point in time, and I said, I'm so puzzled by how exactly this whole pipeline thing is going to develop, because if I'm the only one of 12 that meets, you know, the South African demographic dimensions, as you may call it, in 10 or 15 years' time, when this bank has to select from one of us, the first thing that you have to do is hope that I'm still here, because if I'm not here, whoever you choose from will actually not meet the transformation demographics that you're trying to fix in the country at large. So that's what then forced me to then ask the question of, well, if you get to these particular institutions and you can already see that the pipeline is compromised, where has it gone wrong? And I took it a step back and then I said, well, let us try to actually fix it at university level. So that's what I got into academia to do, because for me, the feeling was, if we're going to get this transformation right, we cannot afford to be taking the shortcut approach of hoping that by the time CVs show up, there'll be enough black CVs to choose from. You actually have to invest in that particular pipeline. And that is the complementarity that Busi was referring to, in that it's fine, we can talk about the ownership stakes, that's an overnight transaction, but the development of the other aspects of empowerment was a much longer project. And I don't think we actually paid as much attention to it as we needed to. And even if we did pay attention to it, maybe the investment that we put into it was not sufficient. So what we're now facing with is the reality that, of course, now when everybody looks at these numbers today, PwC released a report last month saying that in the JSE, you hardly find a woman leading the company as a CEO, you hardly find a black person. And for me, this is the type of data that doesn't surprise me, because I saw it 15 years ago to say that in the absence of an active development of this particular pipeline, this is what you're going to face later on. The secondary issue that I actually want to deliberate on is what Busi mentioned earlier on, in that at the end of the day, remember, BBBEE was not really about the broad empowerment of South African citizens, because even if you look at the most generously structured deals, and I think Sithole is probably one of the examples of those, where you essentially have to pay, I think, 1% in order to participate. The point of saying that you need to have an element of financial, participation in order to be a shareholder simply means that you're speaking to a very limited audience. There are far too many South African citizens, far too many Black South Africans who will never, ever have a job to begin with. So even if you had every single BE deal being, widely subscribed for, there are far too many citizens who quite simply will never participate in these things anyway. So the question that we need to sort of try and figure out is, what do we think the big idea was? If we want to acknowledge that maybe the idea was to simply say, look, even in the white community, for example, it's not 100% of everyone who's an entrepreneur or everyone who's a billionaire. It's always a fraction of that society. If that's what we're trying to put together, then we should have said so, to say, look, we're just hoping that we're going to get maybe 100 Black industrialists or 100 Black billionaires. And that's fine. At least we're being honest about it. But we sold it as part of this agenda to say that everybody, by virtue of being a citizen, everybody by virtue of being Black, is going to be able to actively participate in this economy, and this is what we do in order to get them to get there. And of course, that has turned out not to be accurate. So for me in particular, the focus on training Black chartered accountants in particular is that I always imagine that at some point in time, what most of us would probably wish to have is to have the ability and the autonomy to participate in the economy on our own terms. So that if somebody is going to be a chartered accountant, they're probably going to earn in the top 5% of salary scales in South Africa. That for me is the license that gets them to own their way through this particular economy. Because even if you look at those that did benefit well from the BE deal, literally the terms had to be prescribed to them to say, this is the only way to participate. This is the only way the deal can be funded, because you bankrupt. No matter how influential you are as a Black person, you cannot invest 100 million rand. So for me, the big idea is to say that should we ever have a new revival or a new iteration of these BE deals, there will be many more Black people who say, oh no, if the participation fee is that much, I'll be able to finance it my way. And that will make it different from the old deals, because those people that participate on day one will be able to then fully harness the economic windfall associated with this ownership stake. And that would, in the long run, essentially mitigate against the fallout that we see at the expiry of all these lock-in periods, where everybody says, finally, I can have access to my money, and they essentially sell at even the wrong prices, for example, because, you have to ask them, are you getting out of this because the economic fundamentals say so, or is it simply because you're tired of having somebody prescribe to you that, wait, even though you're an owner of this particular stake, I will tell you how to deal with it. And that for me is the great difference that I was hoping to make. And as it turns out, load shedding just struck, which is just another irony of where we are as a country.
I know it has struck us. We've lost Duma as well to load shedding. Sorry about that. Look, I want us to take it a little bit further, but before that, let me, because you guys said some important things that I want us to take forward here. There's Justin Prozeski who says, we have to think of this as a pyramid, so that there were some people who were, at the top, while there are some people at the bottom, community-focused elements, and that were at the bottom that were missed. But I think it's something interesting in the sense that it's interesting that with all the technology that we've got and all the science, we have got the most sophisticated financial system, we still struggle to figure out who owns what in terms of share registers. And then the anonymous attendee talks about that we've got a long way to go to achieve equality. We have to do it at our own pace and tailor-make the system to meet our own needs. But one would have thought that's what we did. Obviously, we've had the 2 iterations here. Khaya, you raised some interesting things at the beginning, which I want to talk about in terms of the BE deals that were done. We know that, of course, they've included borrowing. And that borrowing has been important because also we know that some of the deals, people were not buying the particular share, they were buying the likeness of a share. So you would buy, a structure that's related to a share that would own the shares for you and would be locked in. And one of the interesting things about that, of course, is that if anybody thinks about investing, one of the basic things we are taught about investing is that you have to be able to get in and out. You've got to be able to diversify, because part of the thing is when we hear news, for example, that a CEO is resigning today, you want to be able to get out. Or if you hear that you've invested in a sector like, such as agriculture, and you hear there's going to be a problem about fertilizer, you want to be able to get out. But if you're invested as a Black person in a business like that, you're locked in for 5 years in a likeness of a share. So the design itself seems to me a bit problematic. But if we know all of these things, right? Or why have we not raised all of these things? Because I'm listening to all of this kind of thing, because there are more deals that are coming up. In what ways should we be starting to think about the design itself? You know, I mean, because if I am asked to speak about in the next 30 minutes about how we design wealth, I mean, the education and income thing is important, Busi, because you are saying people have to be able to earn those incomes. Once you earn an income, you accumulate a surplus, then you can invest it. But there's also some other distribution that we are talking about. These have been the so-called BEE deals. How do we design on both sides? Because I think that's an important thing. And I'd like to invite the other people that have joined us. If you want to put up your hand, I'd be happy to put your hand so that I can hear how we think about designing it so that it works better. People who have experience in BEE deals, it'd be very good to hear from you, where you've been in terms of whether you've bought in one of the, Putuma Nati, Tandatina, all of them, how you have experienced them, how you think we should design them, and what options we've got, because we've got to think about how do we move forward and how do we support people who want to participate and be given Khaya, and then Busi.
Yeah, so you're probably going to think I'm obsessed with the Sithole deal, but I think the Sithole deal is a classic case of the problem that we created. Because remember, when the Sithole deal was put together, it was at a point in time where oil prices, which obviously underpin the Sithole share price, were at a particular level. And because people were locked in for a 10-year period on this hybrid structure, it simply meant that even when oil prices reached record highs and they felt that, wait, hold on, I only owe FNB 100,000 Rand in relation to these shares that are now valued at 300,000. Surely, if I can sell half my shareholding at 150,000 Rand, I'll be able to pay off the loan tomorrow. But because of the lock-in rules, people couldn't even participate from that particular upside. And as that turned out, unfortunately for those shareholders, as it turned out, at the point in time that the lock-in period ended, the entire scheme was dead in the water, simply because everybody had said that this is the model that you need to put together, and that model was completely immune to the reality of what happens within a 10-year period. You're very right, Xhanti, in saying that, in any other market definition, the ability to get in and out of transaction based on market fundamentals, based on your own persuasion, underpins the market efficiency. In essence, BEE transactions are the definition of imperfect markets because it prohibits people from actually transacting as they see fit. So the issue here is that if you had to go and say, let us redo the Sithole deal, for example, with the understanding that far too many external and exogenous factors are going to underpin the performance of this particular share, surely you should have a model that says, okay, once all the Black people have pulled in the amount of capital that is required for them to participate in this deal, that amount of capital then gets pulled into a fund manager, for example. I can use the PIC, for example, because everybody understands what it does. And it is that particular fund manager that then says, wait, hold on, at this time, it looks like the market fundamentals are so favorable, we feel we can be able to dispose a part of the stake so that we can deal with the loan conundrum. Because once the loan conundrum is sorted, you could actually even accelerate the end of the lock-in period. So a model that then simply says that you cannot have this blanket lock-in period that denies people the ability to transact with the shares as they see fit, even though you want them to remain part of the shareholding structure, that then says that that third-party manager will say, look, in this particular instance, we've taken 5% of everybody's shareholding, we've put it in the open market because at that rate, it enables us to pay back 10% of the loan, for example. That's a type of structure that you would have imagined people would start thinking about now, because the evidence in front of us is that, unfortunately, there's very hard lock-in periods have not given us the right outcomes. And what we've seen is that as soon as they end, everybody says, I want to get out of here because you cannot keep prescribing to me what I should do with my shares if you insist that I'm a shareholder.
I mean, Khaya, I want to throw some gasoline on that fire with the Sithole one. Aren't they locked in for another 10 years? I'm sure something crazy like that. They've locked them in for another 10 years. I mean, economically, it makes no sense.
Yeah. I think sometimes people are very bad students, and it clearly it's people who haven't been part of my accounting classes that put these deals together. Because, one of the things that you'd have thought would have been the big learning point for Sithole at that point in time was to say, okay, cool. Clearly, far too much of what you do is actually beyond the control of the people that we call our executives. The people at Sithole just hope that Putin doesn't decide to invade another country tomorrow because it has so much effect on what they do and how their business performs. So with the benefit of hindsight and the reality was that the Sasol executives, more than any other executive in the country, are the ones that were at the saw the worst of this, because remember, they then had to deal with the question of then saying, at the end of 10 years, the loans have not been paid off. So they had two options. The first option was to go back to these black shareholders to say, remember what we told you guys 10 years ago? Well, actually, it turns out we were wrong. So if you want these shares to be in your name 10 years later, they would promised you, you need to pay this additional amount. Now, obviously, that was a difficult sell. So they decided not to go to these black shareholders when the mathematics of the transaction actually said that's what they should have done. So option two is that you then go back to the shareholders who, remember, 10 years ago, actually gave up a part of their wealth and a part of their equity in order to facilitate this deal. You come back to them 10 years later and say, oh, by the way, we need you to sacrifice a bit more. Now, that was an equally difficult point to sell. But I think between the two, Sasol has decided, look, it's better off to piss off the shareholders rather than saying to black shareholders that they owe Sasol, because it was just not going to sound like a good story to tell. So now what we have is that they then decided to go with, a rollover model. And in the rollover model, they're again hoping that the outcomes will be fundamentally different by the time it expires. But for me, it reflects perhaps the rigidity in the thinking that underpins so many of these structures, and the inability for those that are empowered to actually change this model to be able to answer the simple question of what exactly is it that you're trying to achieve in the first place. And if what you think is the model to do it is not getting you there, then think of something different. So I think until we have the type of people that have the ability to think differently, we're going to see a rollover of far too many of these deals, particularly in the mining sector, simply because nobody wants to be the first one to say, well, actually, if it hasn't worked out, we need to do it differently if we still believe in what these things ought to be. But all the investment bankers are of the same opinion about how all these things should be done. So here we are.
I mean, they're not economists, evidently. They're not, because if you think about it, if an economist had structured this, that's why in South Africa, the way we do our social grants is there aren't rules to this, and there isn't sort of food stamps. We have to think, because we know economically you get more benefit if I can decide what I actually want to do with my money. The minute I'm locked in, sort of there's this deadweight loss, and I'm not getting any sort of consumer surplus out of this, like micro style. So they decided to do it that way. And I wonder if they did it that way because the recipients of this, the people, the participants of this were Black. Because for me, it feels almost like, I don't know, you're treating me like a kid. You absolutely, and nobody thought that economically, nowhere has it ever. They shoved sort of neoclassical economics down our throats at South African universities, and they did the one thing you're not supposed to do using that model. So it just, but I mean, I think, Khaya, the model that you're thinking about now, it's like you can do with your money what you want to once the debt has been paid off. I mean, that makes more sort of, it's neoclassically, it even makes sense. It's not even, you don't even have to go wild. So we didn't even need Duma on here. just neoclassically, the white system. That's what the white system tells us.
It's an interesting thing, Busi, that I want to ask you, but it's interesting because actually that's a pervasive thinking. I used to fight, I was once advisor to Minister of Housing. We used to fight about this also lock-in period that you see in housing, right? You can't sell a house until 10 years, which means you can't realize any value from the house. You can't move if you get a job because we've given you a house in Dundee. You must stay in Dundee. But there's also something that Duma, I hoped you would be here, but we've lost him to load shedding. But we say, I don't know if you have a view on this. Interest rates are an important part of these deals, right? Because there's also borrowing. And we know that should policy also be thinking about these things? So if I'm thinking now, if you participated in any kind of transaction like this, or you borrowed to finance a deal, if the interest rates are going to keep going up like this, well, I wonder what sort of effect that would have on a deal such as this one. I'd like your thoughts, but on not so much on we hate policy, but what would be possible?
I mean, it would not be possible. So if we look at the way the Reserve Bank and central banks throughout the world are structured, that would not be possible. So the way we're looking at it, the neoclassical style, the way we're looking at this is, listen here, the duty of the Reserve Bank is to protect the value of the rand. It's not to bail Busi out because I borrowed money in order to actually pay for these Sasol shares, and now our interest rates are going up. But we need to quantify that, and we need to have told shareholders that. And it's the game, because I wonder if it's because it's Black shareholders they're not told. If you're going to borrow money to do this, you must think of two. You must think of how the market moves and you're locked in, and you must think of interest rates. The Reserve Bank is not going to come and help you here because it's not their job to help you here. So their job is to protect the value of the rand. That is it. And in South Africa, we've dogmatically taken that one. Look, it is what happens in the rest of the world, but we've dogmatically done it. They're not going to help you. But we should quantify it, and we should say, for every 50 basis points like your mortgage, this is how much you're paying extra. And in 10 years' time, it just doesn't make it worth it. So it must be a government structure that almost bails you out for things like that. It cannot be the Reserve Bank.
So basically, if you were writing if this BE deal is being written, somebody should say in the documentation, this we see, bring an economist who says, what do we see in the next 10 years in terms of inflation and interest rates? And this is what is likely to happen over that period.
The economist is going to be wrong. They're definitely going to be wrong. But I would just like them to show a few scenarios to say, if interest rates do this, then this is what it means. If interest rates, and don't give me, I think it's the Sithole one as well. They've got a calculation. But the calculation is just like, you need a scientific, I need to be doing the calculation. Either you give me a thing that I can press in buttons on a computer to show you your risk profile, or it must be something I can do on a normal, on my cell phone, and not a scientific calculator to the power or whatever. And I'm going to take the log of this, and I'm going to do the square root of this. Just something simple to tell people their risk. I think that is my biggest thing here.
Okay. Somebody, Tiago Moseneke, I've allowed you to speak, so if you unmute, you'll be able to say something.
Yeah. No. So the only point I really want to make here is that the whole premise of BEE, and if it is to work, it must make commercial sense for the companies which decide to embark on some BEE restructuring. So there must be some benefit that accrues to that company for doing the BEE transaction. And the benefit, that value add benefit, must accrue to the new BEE shareholder. But what the business community has been mute on is that it has not quantified what is the rand value benefit to Sithole for concluding a BEE transaction, and have they passed the value over to the BEE transaction?
Well, Tiago, let's think about it like this. Let's think about it like this. Many of the businesses do it because they want to do business with government, right? That you are required to have some level of a scorecard. So if you have a BE deal, your scorecard improves, then we can do business with government. That's the one part. And so that, I mean, you do want them to say quantify that, because that's value, right? Because one of the best buyers in the market at the moment is the government. So that's not.
I'm sure the clever guys in the room now can tell us in each instance, what is the real value to the shareholders of the company that does a BEE transaction or Sithole each time they achieve a certain level of BEE certification, and to test whether they are passing that value over to the BEE transaction. If they are not doing that, what really is the point? So that is a conversation that we must eyeball all the time. If ABSA does a BEE transaction as a banker, what is it? How is it valued to them? And are they passing that value to the BEE transactors? Or are they leaving the BEE transactors to the value of growth in the market in the ordinary?
Yeah. Very well understood. Thank you very much for that. Thanks very much for that point. I see Ponzo, you're back. So I'm gonna give you 2 minutes before I close.
Okay. Is
Ponzo? Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, good. I have a question I need to ask as a BBBEE, okay? So as a black person, which levels you must have on your BEE to get a finance from a bank? Maybe you don't have a money, person like me. How can you find money borrow money from the bank? Because last time I went to another bank, they told me my levels are down. So I don't know. Can someone else help me on that thing? I don't know. My question is understandable.
Yes. Thanks very much for that. That is a topic we are going to bring to the next two conversations. So it won't be answered here. But I think, it won't be answered here. But if you join us in the next two, we'll definitely be able to answer that question, because it's an important question that a lot of people are raising about how actually the financial sector helps people grow. So we wanted today to just start this. I'm assuming you're not issuing a BE deal anytime soon. So, but before that, we'll be able to answer that. Let's close it because we have got 5 more minutes. Let me first read some of the comments that we've received. So somebody, Malcolm Maslatini says, to Khaya and Duma, in the mining sector, we now are under the once empowered, always empowered principle as per mining charter. In my view, this is a criminal against Black people. This is criminal against Black people. And perhaps the question is, what legal instruments can we utilize to reverse such principle, especially challenge government on this principle? Okay, I'm going to ask you to actually maybe explain a little bit about this principle and why it is useful and why it's something that can be taken forward. And then Reginald, so guys, I think the big question is, why are we so pedantic about the neo-colonial laws, of which are there to protect the white economic power that seeks to protect the elite? Maybe we'll close that. Once we've done those two questions, I'm then going to close the discussion, because I don't want us to go over the time that we've been given. And then I will just do some closing so that everybody understands what the way forward is in terms of the discussion that we've had today. Khaya?
Thank you. So I think the mining example is a remarkably important one. And the short history behind it is that obviously mining, given its contested role in our social and economic history, was always going to be the one sector where the need for the greatest elements of redress were to be demanded. But unfortunately, the mining sector, like any other sector, went for this whole dual model of saying, we'll empower some capitalists and then we'll try and do something for everybody else. So if you look at the whole social and labor plan regime, for example, that we've put into place, it's the one that says that for all the people that work in this mine and the affected communities, you need to create living conditions that are at least human, no longer as subhuman as they used to be long before. So the social and labor plans are a remarkably important part of the licensing condition for mining companies in South Africa. In every single company, with perhaps the exception of Kumba, which I've tested in the Northern Cape, those social and labor plans never really live up to expectation. These social and labor plans spectacularly failed to live up to expectation in Marikana 10 years ago, which is what actually precipitated the origins of that mining strike. What happens on the capitalist side is that just like every other part of the BE empowerment deals, what the mining houses then negotiated with the state was to say, look, we're going to obviously give away part of our equity onto these particular Black shareholders, right? So that, as usual, subject to these lock-in periods, either 10 years or whatever the period might be. And then what happened after that 10-year lock-in period, naturally, all those Black shareholders then decided, well, it's our money to do with it as you see fit. And then suddenly you had this dramatic fall overnight of the empowerment profile of a company. So it could have been 26% yesterday, and then it's 3% tomorrow. So that same company then goes to government and then says, look, we're carrying on with our operations. And then the government says, wait, hold on, you are at 3%. And then the company says, no, we were at 25% until those individuals that own the 25% decided, as everyone is entitled to do, that they wanted to sell their shares, that they wanted to transact elsewhere. So as I said earlier on, and I think Mr. Prozeski also mentioned, is that once a company ends the lock-in period, they cannot tell tomorrow who owns the shares. It is quite ridiculous that in South Africa we can't tell who owns shares on any given day. But that is the problem that the mining companies faced. So the mining companies then argued that, look, we actually applied the rules as you wrote them. You simply said to us, we must put in a BEE deal, and then after 25% shareholding must go to Black people, for example, and that's what we did. The fact that these individuals have then decided to go and diversify their portfolios and buy other things is not something that we must be held accountable for. So they argued that we were empowered yesterday, we should be regarded as empowered today, unless the instruction is very explicit that every 10 years, we need to literally find a new class of Black BE shareholders, revalue our business at 25%, and then give that away and then finance it again. But the government has never written such rules. So until such rules exist, companies are then saying, we've done what we thought would needed to be done. And the only way the government is actually able to enforce essentially a new BE deal is when there is an application for new order mining rights, as you may call it. So if you as a mining company say, oh, we want to start something new, then the government says, oh no, in relation to those operations, you've definitely never been empowered because they didn't exist yesterday. So therefore you must put it together. So that's how we ended up with this idea of once empowered, always empowered. Now, of course, everybody argues that it is senseless. It doesn't make sense that you could wake up today and have 0% Black ownership in any of these mining companies, and yet all of them get full credits, as Duma said, from 1998, for example. And that is the philosophical conversation that the country needs to deliberate on. Do we feel that we must enforce them to get into perpetual empowerment deals so that the answer is always above a particular percentage? If that's what we want to do, then you must write the laws that are conducive to that. But for the government to simply hope that things are going to materialize is what we've been going through now. And then under litigation, they get told that, well, the rules don't exist. And until you write the rules, you cannot hold anyone accountable to anything. So that's where once empowered, always empowered comes from. If the government didn't want it, they could have done something about it. And they haven't.
Thank you very much. Busi?
I mean, Reginald's question is also a very philosophical one. I agree with you completely, Reginald. I absolutely agree with you. I think that question is best posed to policymakers who've decided that this is the way we're going to run things. I think it's just, as we end, let's burn it all down. I think it's just a thing of white supremacy. Everything that happens in the West is better, and we need to emulate that. And that's why we see that come through when we do policy in the country. So, Reginald, the policymakers, you should ask them why they keep on doing this.
It's interesting you should say that. You are a student at the moment doing a PhD in Amsterdam and teaching them in the West.
But they don't even. What is so scary is I teach first year and second year intermediate micro, and they've moved away from this neoclassical thing, and they're more heterodox, and they're using the economy, the core syllabus. They have moved away, and we still are insisting on remaining that way.
Thank you. I think Khaya gives us a very good closing today in terms of what we wanted to discuss, because it leans into whether or not we are creating the empowerment. So the mining sector has done all this work, and all of these deals that once people have been empowered, we're not even able to measure how much that impact has been created in the role, towards the path of empowering people. I want to remind everybody that everything we've been talking about is about inclusive growth, and two elements, which is increased participation of the poor and marginalized. That really speaks about making sure that people are employed and they're participating in economic processes, which Busi has really spoken about quite strongly. And then the second part is about benefits of growth. So we are benefiting for the so-called growth, whether we are actually gaining in wealth or we are becoming richer. And on both parts, we seem to be struggling in South Africa because unemployment is still astronomically high. So it's inequality and poverty. And so we wanted these sessions really to take us forward in terms of how do we think, how do we bring in the right kinds of minds, the right kinds of thinking, and yourselves to talk about how we can actually break down the problems that we've been facing so that we can move forward. This was the first one, and we thought that it might be important to start with BEE deals and to answer this question in this way. And then going forward, we then break down further how people can really and truly participate in terms of employment and how we bring. So the next two topics speak very much then in terms of following up from the next themes. We're going to talk about pension funds and the future of workers in that next theme. And really there, we want to talk about how your investment, some people say your pension is in the JSE, some people say your savings are in the JSE. How does it actually drive economic growth, and how does it drive inclusive growth? What choices can you make and what votes can you make with your pension in terms of the trustees that you put in there or the voice that you've got? And then another discussion that is very important is also the saving schemes of women, or the saving schemes of many people that they work in, whether they are in communities or they are across geographies, and how that can be an opportunity for inclusive growth. One of the Khaya suggested, for example, that perhaps we first save and then take those savings into BEE deals rather than to borrow. Is that possible, and is that something that we can think about going forward? So these next two themes will be very important in terms of addressing some of the issues that have come up here, because it's about how we build solutions and how we sequence inclusion and transformation in a manner that we see an outcome that is much better. I'm really, really grateful to our speakers that were able to join us. Today, Busisiwe Radebe, all the way from Amsterdam, doing her PhD and teaching in issues of inequality and definitely economics, and thinking about poverty. And then, of course, Khaya Sithole, who's an activist who has worked very, very hard in terms of developing skills for young people, and also works in the activism in the financial sector, especially with young professionals. And then lastly, Duma, who we lost to load shedding, who has done a lot of work on transformation and BEE deals. What we will do is to share this podcast. We'll put it up on YouTube so that it's accessible for anybody who wants to hear it again. We'll also do a transcript and an insights document so that you can also access it and think through some of the things that have emerged today. I will continue to spend time in the media to try and advance some of the ideas that emerged today and the questions that emerged today. But for now, thank you very, very much for having